My name's Dr. Rhiannon Firth. I did my PhD in political theory at the University of Nottingham, and it focused on intentional communities. So for those who don't know what an intentional community is, it's also known as a hippie commune. It's an intentional community means groups of people who've chosen to live and often work together in order to enhance their shared values. So they live together for reasons other than economics or friendship or family. So I'm particularly interested in intentional communities, and I'm interested in anarchist political theory and anarchist utopias. And also the ways in which radical political theories like anarchism rethink the forms and scale of political communities. So hence the overlap with architecture. I'm interested in kind of space, the sort of space and scale of politics, but I'm not an architecture person, so I've chosen to read Colin Ward because I feel like he's a good overlap between my interests in political theory and anarchism and architecture. And I'm very grateful to Alicia Pavaro for inviting me to do this, and also Rosie Gibbs for helping me with the technology, and also my good friend Tim Waterman, who encouraged me to take part, who's done some of the other bedtime stories in this series. So it's 9 o'clock now, so welcome everyone. As I've just been saying, my name's Rhiannon Firth. I work as a senior research officer at the University of Essex at the moment. I'm in sociology, but my PhD was in politics. And I met Alicia, who invited me here briefly last November in an event that I did, that I organised on ecotopias. And I was invited to contribute on that basis. And I was invited to aim to contribute to the series on the basis that it's about co-producing thinking on utopia through sharing some of our favourite writers from around the world and across the years, on the basis that they might try and help us rethink the world after the virus, post-virus. So I'm going to offer at least 3 different readings as part of this series, and because my interest is in anarchist utopias, all of my offerings are going to focus on anarchist approaches to imagining utopia. But the ones that I've chosen, ones that sort of locate utopias in different temporal zones. So this week I'm going to be reading from Colin Ward, who locates utopia and radical practice in the present and in everyday life. Next time I read, I'm going to be reading from Freddie Perlman, who locates utopia in a sort of pre-civilized past and in what he sees as kind of natural human community that predates civilization. Later readings I'm going to do will include PM's Bolo Bolo, which locates utopia in an imaginary space or a potential future. So I'm going to try and offer these sort of 3 different utopias from different temporal zones. But today I'm going to be talking about Colin Ward, who I believe Ken Warpole has already given a lecture about today on The Child in the City. So if you tuned in for that, you might already know a little bit about Colin Ward. He was born in 1924 and he died in 2010, which was the year I completed my PhD. And it seems like a very recent memory for me, but it's actually a decade ago, so time really does fly. And he was involved in the London-based anarchist newspapers Freedom and Anarchy throughout the late 40s to the 70s, and he worked as an architect from 1952 to 1961, and he was incredibly prolific, and he published on architecture, education and town planning. So the book I'm going to be reading from today is Anarchy and Action. It's a brilliant book. It's one of my favourite books on anarchism, actually. And it was written as an introduction to anarchism for people who had little knowledge on the subject. So he draws quite heavily on classical anarchists like Peter Kropotkin, Gustav Landauer, Mikhail Bakunin, but he also utilises more contemporary examples. Well, contemporary to the 70s when it was written. It was written in 1973, I think. But I think this book's incredibly relevant to the current context because it's very much about mutual aid, and it's about how people can organise in the here and now to make their lives better, to self-organise without the state. And that's something that's really happening at the moment around COVID-19. There's a lot of mutual aid groups, thousands all over the country, organising to help people in need because the state is in many circumstances being completely useless. So I think mutual aid is a really important concept right now. We're seeing it happen everywhere, and it's interesting because I've joined a few of these mutual aid groups, partly to get involved and partly because it's my research topic and I'm interested in seeing what people are up to. I've noticed there's a lot of arguments where people are asking to keep politics out of it. So one of the reasons I want to talk about Colin Ward is Colin Ward sees mutual aid as an inherently political concept. It's an anarchist concept, and it's inherently political. And the extract I've chosen begins, I'm just going to begin right at the beginning with Colin Ward's preface to the first edition. And in this he gives an incredibly clear statement of his theory of anarchism as a form of organisation. So Colin Ward doesn't see anarchism as a sort of utopia that can happen in the future. He sees it as a way that we can organise in the here and now. And then since the preface is quite short, I'm also going to read a little bit from chapter 3, which is about the dissolution of leadership, which I think gives a great answer to a commonly held objection to anarchism, that organisation without authority is impossible. So one of the reasons people say organisation without authority is impossible is because some people have more or better knowledge than others, so they ought to lead. So I'm going to read the chapter where Colin Ward sort of deals with that argument and disputes it. And he draws on traditional anarchist sources to back his argument up, like Bakunin and Kropotkin. But he also draws on research by the Royal Institute of British Architects. So even though I'm not an architect myself, I thought that the passage that I've chosen might be particularly relevant for the Architecture Foundation. But it's also highly illustrative of Ward's wonderful tendency to find examples and evidence from aspects of everyday life that one wouldn't usually consider anarchist. So without further ado, I'll get started on reading tonight's bedtime story from Colin Ward's Anarchy and Action. Okay. How would you feel if you discovered that the society in which you would really like to live was already here, apart from a few little local difficulties like exploitation, war, dictatorship and starvation? The argument of this book is that an anarchist society, a society which organises itself without authority, is always in existence, and its bureaucracy, capitalism, its waste, privilege, and its injustices, nationalism and its suicidal loyalties, religious difficulties and their superstitious separatism. Sorry, I skipped a line there. Can everyone hear me? I'm worried my internet's not working. Can someone give me a wave or a hello? Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, so I'll start from where I got lost there. Oh, good, you can hear me. Good. I'm a bit worried about my internet connection because it does dip sometimes. So okay, good. I'll get the bit I missed. So the argument of this book is that an anarchist society, a society which organises itself without authority, is always in existence, like a seed beneath the snow, buried under the weight of the state and its bureaucracy, capitalism and its waste, privileges and its injustices, nationalism and its suicidal loyalties, religious differences and their superstitious separatism. Of the many possible interpretations of anarchism, the one presented here suggests that, far from being a speculative vision of a future society, it is a description of a mode of human organisation rooted in the experience of everyday life, which operates side by side with and in spite of the dominant authoritarian trends of our society. This is not a new version of anarchism. Gustav Landauer saw it not as the founding of something new, but as the actualization and reconstitution of something that has always been present, which exists alongside the state, albeit buried and laid waste. And a modern anarchist, Paul Goodman, declared that a free society cannot be the substitution of a new order for the old order. It is the extension of spheres of free action until they make up most of social life. You may think that in describing anarchy as organisation, I am being deliberately paradoxical. Anarchy you may consider to be, by definition, the opposite of organisation. But the word really means something quite different. It means the absence of government, the absence of authority. It is, after all, governments which make and enforce the laws that enable the haves to retain control of social assets to the exclusion of the have-nots. It is, after all, the principle of authority which ensures that people will work for someone else for the greater part of their lives. Not because they enjoy it or have any control over their work, but because to do so is their only means of livelihood. It is, after all, governments which prepare for and wage war, even though you are obliged to suffer the consequences of their going to war. But is it only governments? The power of a government, even the most absolute dictatorship, depends on the agreement of the governed. Why do people consent to be ruled? It isn't only fear. What have millions of people to fear from a small group of professional politicians and their paid strong-arm men? It is because they subscribe to the same values as their governors. Rulers and ruled alike believe in the principle of authority, of hierarchy, of power. They even feel themselves privileged when, as happens in a small part of the globe, they can choose between alternative labels and ruling elites. And yet, in their ordinary lives, they keep society going by voluntary association and mutual aid. Anarchists are people who make a social and political philosophy out of the natural and spontaneous tendency of humans to associate together for their mutual benefit. Anarchism is in fact the name given to the idea that it is possible, and indeed desirable, for society to organise itself without government. The word comes from the Greek meaning without authority, and ever since the time of the Greeks, there have been advocates of anarchy under one name or another. The first person in modern times to evolve a systematic theory of anarchism was William Godwin, soon after the French Revolution. A Frenchman, Proudhon, in the mid-19th century, developed an anarchist theory of social organisation, of small units federated together but with no central power. He was followed by the Russian revolutionary Michael Bakunin, the contemporary and adversary of Karl Marx. Marx represented one wing of the socialist movement, concentrating on seizing the power of the state. Bakunin represented the other, seeking the destruction of state power. Another Russian, Peter Kropotkin, sought to give a scientific foundation to anarchist ideas by demonstrating that mutual aid, voluntary cooperation, is just as strong a tendency in human life as aggression and the urge to dominate. The famous names of anarchism recur in this book simply because what they wrote speaks, as the Quakers say, to our condition. But there were thousands of other obscure revolutionaries, propagandists and teachers who never wrote books for me to quote, but who tried to spread the idea of society without government in almost every country in the world, and especially in the revolutions in Mexico, Russia and Spain. Everywhere they were defeated, and the historians wrote that anarchism finally died when Franco's troops entered Barcelona in 1939. But in Paris in 1968, anarchist flags flew over the Sorbonne, And in the same year, they were seen in Brussels, Rome, Mexico City, New York, and even in Canterbury. All of a sudden, people were talking about the need for the kind of politics in which ordinary men, women, and children decide their own fate and make their own future. About the need for social and political decentralisation, about workers' control of industry, about pupil power in school, about community control of the social services. Anarchism, instead of being a romantic historical byway, becomes an attitude to human organisation which is more relevant today than it ever seemed in the past. Organisation and its problems have developed a vast and expanding literature because the importance of the subject for the hierarchy of government administration and industrial management. Very little of this vast literature provides anything of value for the anarchist except in his role as destructive critic or saboteur of the organisations that dominate our lives. The fact is that while there are thousands of students and teachers of government, there are hardly any of non-government. There is an immense amount of research into methods of administration. Oh, there's someone singing outside. But hardly any into self-regulation. There are whole libraries on and expensive courses in industrial management and very large fees for consultants in management. But there is scarcely any literature, no course of study, and certainly no fees for those who want to do away with management and substitute workers' autonomy. The brains are sold to the big battalions, and we have to build up a theory of non-government, of non-management from the kind of history and experience which has hardly been written about, because nobody thought it all that important. History, said W.R. Leatherby, is written by those who survive. Philosophy by the well-to-do, those who have to who go under have the experience. But once you begin to look at human society from an anarchist point of view, you discover that the alternatives are already there in the interstices of the dominant power structure. If you want to build a free society, the parts are already at hand. Okay, so that was the preface, and then I'm going to read some very briefly for my last 10 minutes or so from Chapter 3 on the dissolution of leadership, after I have a little sip of wine to cheer me up. Okay, so the dissolution of leadership. So this chapter starts with a quote by a person who I'm afraid I don't know, John Comerford, Health the Unknown, the Story of the Peckham Expert. I'll read the quote because I quite like it. Accustomed as it is to this age of artificial leadership, it is difficult for it to realise the truth that leaders require no training or appointing, but emerge spontaneously when conditions require them. Studying their members in the free-for-all of the Peckham Centre, the observing scientists saw over and over again how one member became and was instinctively, but not officially, recognised as leader to meet the needs of one particular moment. The title is, it's Colin Ward's Anarchy and Action, for the person who just joined. Such leaders appeared and disappeared as the flux of the centre required, because they were not consciously appointed. Neither, when they had fulfilled their purpose, were they consciously overthrown. Nor was any gratitude shown by members to a leader either at the time of his services or after services rendered. They followed his guidance just as long as his guidance was helpful and what they wanted. They melted away from him without regrets when something widening of experience beckoned them on to some fresh adventure, which would in turn throw up its spontaneous leader, or when their self-confidence was such that any form of constrained leadership would have been a restraint to them. So that was a quote from John Comerford that starts Chapter 3 on the dissolution of leadership, and I'm just going to read a brief bit from this. Take me to your leader. This is the first demand made by the Martians to Earthlings, policemen to demonstrators, journalists to revolutionaries. Some journalists, said one of them to Daniel Cohn-Bendit, have described you as the leader of the revolution. He replied, let them write their rubbish. These people will never be able to understand that the student movement doesn't need any chiefs. I'm neither a leader nor a professional revolutionary. I'm simply a mouthpiece, a megaphone. Anarchists believe in leaderless groups. And if this phrase is familiar, it is because of the paradox that what was known as the leaderless group technique was adopted in the British and Australian armies during the war, and in industrial management since then, as a means of selecting leaders. The military psychologists learned that what they considered to be leader or follower traits are not exhibited in isolation. They are, as one of them wrote, relative to a specific situation. Leadership varied from situation to situation and group to group. Or, as the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin put it, over 100 years ago, I receive and I give, such is human life. Each directs and is directed in his turn. Therefore, there is no fixed and constant authority, but a continual exchange of mutual, temporary, and above all, voluntary authority and subordination. Don't be deceived by the sweet reasonableness of all this. The anarchist concept of leadership is completely revolutionary in its implications, as you can see if you look around, for you will see everywhere in operation the opposite concept, that of hierarchical, authoritarian, privileged, and permanent leadership. There are very few comparative studies available of the effects of these two opposite approaches to the organisation of work. Two of them are mentioned in Chapter 11. Another comes from the architectural profession. The Royal Institute of British Architects sponsored a report on the methods of organisation in architects' offices. The survey team felt able to distinguish two opposite approaches to the process of design, which gave rise to very different ways of working and methods of organisation. One was characterised by a procedure which began by the invention of a building shape and was followed by a moulding of the client's needs to fit inside this three-dimensional preconception. The other began with an attempt to understand fully the needs of the people who were to use the building, around which, when they were clarified, the building would be fitted. For the first type, the basic act of invention and imagination is over. The rest is easy, and the architect makes decisions quickly, produces work to time and quickly enough to make a reasonable profit. The evidence suggests this attitude is the predominant one in the group of offices which we found to be using a centralised type of work, organisation, and it clearly goes with autocratic forms of control. But the other philosophy, from users' needs to building form, makes decision-making much more difficult. The work takes longer and is often unprofitable to the architect, although the client may end up with a much cheaper building put up more quickly than he had expected. Many offices working this way had found themselves better suited by a dispersed type of work organisation which can promote an informal atmosphere of free-flowing ideas. The team found that apart from a small hybrid group of large public offices with very rigid and hierarchical structure, a poor quality of design, poor technical and managerial efficiency, the offices surveyed could be classed as either centralised or dispersed types. Staff turnover, which bore no relation at all to earnings, was high in centralised offices and low in the dispersed ones, where there was considerable delegation of responsibility to assistants, and we found a lively working atmosphere. This is a very live issue among architects, and it was not a young revolutionary architect, but Sir William Pyle, when he was head of the Architects and Buildings branch of the Ministry of Education, who specified the things he looked for in a member of the building team, that he must have a belief in what I call the non-hierarchical organisation of that work. The work has got to be organised not on the star system, but on the repertory system. The team leader may often be a junior team member. That will only be accepted if it is commonly accepted that primacy lies with the best idea, not with the senior man. Again, from the architectural world, Walter Gropius proclaimed that he called the technique of collaboration among men, which would release the creative instincts of the individual instead of smothering them. The essence of such technique should be to emphasise individual freedom of initiative instead of authoritarian directions by a boss, synchronising individual effort by a continuous give and take of its members. I'm going to skip forward a bit. There's a bit more discussion of the findings of this rebirth study, which is really interesting, but I'm going to skip to sort of just one little paragraph here where he sort of vaguely concludes that this fluid changing leadership derives from authority, but the authority derives from each person's self-chosen function in performing the task in hand. You can be in authority, or you can be an authority, or you can have authority. The first derives from your rank in some chain of command. The second derives from special knowledge, and the third from special wisdom. But knowledge and wisdom are not distributed in order of rank, and they are no one person's monopoly in any undertaking. The fantastic inefficiency of any hierarchical organisation, any factory, office, university, warehouse or hospital, is the outcome of two almost invariable characteristics. On the one hand, the knowledge and wisdom of the people at the bottom of the pyramid finds no place in the decision-making leadership of the institution. Frequently it is devoted to making the institution work in spite of the formal leadership structure, or alternatively to sabotaging the ostensible function of the institution because it is none of their choosing. The other is that they would rather not be there anyway. They are there through economic necessity rather than through identification with a common task, which throws up its own shifting and functional leadership. Perhaps the greatest crime of the industrial system is the way in which it systematically thwarts the inventive genius of the majority of its workers. As Kropotkin asked, what can a man invent who is condemned for the rest of life to bind together the ends of two threads with the greatest celerity and knows nothing beyond making a knot? So that's where I'm going to finish, and thank you all for listening to me and listening to the wonderful Colin Ward. Hopefully I'll be back again soon with some more anarchist utopian thinking. Great, thank you very much. Good night. Thank you.